maybe I could just kind of describe one patrol as being more or less generic. If I understand it correctly, the reserve battalion had to provide a company strength patrol every day, reconnaissance patrol usually. This one was a combat patrol, and that's the only one I was ever on as a company strength patrol. Later we went with a battalion strength patrol, but evidently they had gotten word that there were some Japanese on our side of the Matanikau River. And so I think it was L Company they sent to chase them back across the river where they belonged. And I got to go as the radio operator. Incidentally, that was the only way you could get enough to eat. The company that had the patrol that day drew double rations. And the radio operators that went with the company got to eat with the company. So we were prone to volunteering with a fair degree of regularity. The everyday rations were pretty slim and pretty poor because a good part of our food supply went away with the ships when they left. And so we were eating captured Jap oats that they used to feed their horses and captured Jap rice. I managed to find somewhere, I don't remember where it was, a can of Jap pork and beans packed with seaweed. And I guess I'm not very generous or kind of an animal-like type. I hid my can of pork and beans and sneaked off into a gully and ate it all. But the food generally was pretty terrible. The cooks, maybe they could have done worse with what they had to work with, I don't know. But if you can visualize taking 5-pound tins of corned beef and gallon cans of peas and dumping them together in a GI can and stirring it up until everything is unidentifiable and getting it halfway lukewarm and serving that as chow, that was chow. But anyhow, I was with the company and we were walking up the trail along the coast. It's mostly maybe 50, 60 feet from the water. And we were going along, and I guess we were maybe halfway to the Matanikau. And the fellow that was on point came running back to the lieutenant, and he had a little fish in his hand, and it was still wiggling. He'd picked it up out of the trail. And so that kind of gave us the idea that there's somebody up ahead of us. And we went on, and we got, just short of the river, and the lieutenant said, "This will be the CP," so we set our radio up. Great, huge banyan tree. And we set it up on the ocean side of the banyan tree. I guess I remember that location because that's the place I got the most frightened, the most disturbed of any time I was there. I had the radio watch, and we were dug in a hole under a big tree, and in that big tree there was a huge branch about 16, 18 inches in diameter that had broken off and was hooked over another branch, and it turned out to be right directly over our radio. And we had an air raid, which we had every day, and they were bombing along the runway, and my real concern was whether those bombs were going to last till they got to us or not. And I really wasn't worried about the bomb, but I was just sure the bomb was going to jar that big branch loose and it was going to fall on my head. And by the time it was over, they ran out of bombs, fortunately, a quarter of a mile from us. But by the time it was over, I was just shaking so bad that one of the guys gave me a cigarette, and it really calmed my nerves down, and I've been smoking the damn things ever since. So someday I'm going to sue the Marine Corps for starting me smoking. A few minutes later, It was just a god-awful firefight broke out. Apparently, they had walked right into the middle of a Jap bivouac before they realized it. And so this firefight went on for, I guess, half an hour or so, and pretty soon we see these guys running back down the trail. There'd be a couple, and then one, and then a few more. And so we're wondering what is going on, and we're waiting for somebody to come and tell us to pack up and move out. And pretty soon the first sergeant came backing down the trail with his Tommy gun at the ready, and we asked him what's going on. And he turned around and jumped like we'd shot. And, what the hell are you bastards doing here? Don't you know I'm the only one left between you and them? And so we debated for 2 seconds over whether to put a grenade in the radio and blow it up or pack it up and take it. And we decided we'd probably get court-martialed if we blew it up, so we packed it up and took it. But it didn't take long to pack.
Colonel Shapley kept calling me and saying there's a big cave up on Mount Oliphant. And he said there's a gun coming out of that cave that's picking off our landing barges coming in. You got to get it, Phil. We had at that time the M4A2s tanks, which were a medium tank with a 75 millimeter. And I couldn't see this cave because the cave, Mount Oliphant, is a red clay, and they had plastered the door of the cave with that red clay. And they would open it, and they would wheel this gun out and fire about 3 rounds and go back in. So he was really appealing to me to get that gun. So I foolishly jumped out of my tank and to try to talk to somebody, see if he could find out where that gun was. Just about that time, about 30 Japs came up over a little mound right in front of me, and I was out of my tank with a 45 revolver. Well, there was no problem because the tanks just mowed them down in a hurry. And then one of those freaks in war, up comes a guy from another regiment. As in landings, they always get mixed up. And he was a kid that sat across from me in a U.S. history class back in Virginia High School. And I said, Les, and he says, Phil, and I said, where's that gun? He says, I'll tell you exactly where. So he told me where the gun was, and I fired a Willie Peter, that's a white phosphorus, and he says, just above that, about 10 meters. So I got on the radio, told all of the tanks to zero in up on that spot, just above where that Willie Peter had hit, and listen for my load up with it. If you had an HE in, leave it in. Otherwise, put in an AP armor-piercing shell, anti-tank shell, and they all did. I had 18 tanks. So sure enough, that door opens up and whambo. We set all these rounds off. This is a little grim, but there were legs and boots flying, and helmets with heads in them flying, and we knocked out the Jap crew plus the gun, and the gun didn't go back in, nor did the door close. So we fired about another a couple of rounds into it, and then we went ahead and attacked, and we made more ground that day than they expected us to. Very successful day. But we had gone so far that we had overextended our lines, and there were gaps. So it ended up that headquarters, my 3 tanks in my headquarters, plus 1 platoon stayed, I guess, in about 1,000 yards from the beach, just beyond the regimental CP. Another platoon went up and was at a junction of a road called Harmon Road, up towards Mount Oliphant. The 3rd platoon went down south on the right along the beach. That night, all 3 positions were hit, and the most exciting one was up at Harmon Road. They could hear tank noises, and the infantry came running down and said, we need tanks, we hear tanks coming. Well, one of the rules we had was you never move a tank at night. but they're relatively blind. You just have that little periscope. But Jim Williams was my lieutenant up there. He moved the tanks and got them into position, and the gunner was firing a machine gun with tracers. When he saw the tracers going straight up, he let it have a round of HE. And this sounds like a big deal. It isn't, because their tanks were nothing. It blew the entire front of the tank off, set it on fire, and that lit up 4 more tanks coming behind it. And he methodically got 3 more of the tanks. The 5th tank turned and went back into the darkness of the night. And at daylight in the morning, he got that tank out ahead about 2,240 yards. I paced it off, so I know it was that far. All right, that's the first platoon. Then the second platoon, the Japs had come down, and there was a little mound of green grass, looked really great, was ahead of us, maybe 50 to 100 yards. And we didn't give it pay it any attention. But during the night, down came about 40 to 50 Japs, and we finally figured out why they came down. This mound was a pile of ammunition with sod over it, and they were coming down to get that ammunition. Well, in their little firefight, they set one tank on fire, but these were diesel tanks, and we put the tank out just by whipping it with our field jackets, and the tank fought the next day. But I was in the foxhole alongside my tank, and out of the darkness, we still hadn't really established where the Japs were or what they were doing there. And this figure comes up towards me on my tank, and I didn't make it out as a Jap initially. And I pulled my pistol out and had it right on him. He was maybe 5 feet from me, and he turned and put his magnetic mine, which has got 4 magnets, on my tank, and I knew then what it was. And he turned and ran, and I shot and killed him. But the mine went off. As I ducked down in my hole, I had a canteen cup over here filled with cold coffee, and a piece of shrapnel went into that, and it sizzled the coffee, warmed it up for me. And anyhow, in the morning, we had one of our guys. We had telephones on our back of our tanks. He got on the telephone and guided one of the tanks up into this little mound area, and we killed, I think it was 50-some Japs there. And down to the right, south, the 3rd platoon stopped a group of Japs coming up the beach. And Colonel Shapley called and says, congratulated me and our tankers, and said, okay, you guys saved the beachhead. He said, we never could have stopped them without the tanks.
Corpsman we carried our assault pack, which is a double pack, with a bedroll over the top of it. We had 2 medical pouches. We had our own individual medical pouch. We had ammunition pouches. We had a gas mask. We had a machete and our rifle. And when we made an assault landing, we also had to carry an additional packet of medical supplies strapped to the front of us. Some of these weighed from anywhere from 50 to 100 pounds. The one I had was folded canvas blankets. It was heavy. I don't know how much it weighed, but it could have been close to the upper figure. Then we came down the debarkation nets and transferred into Higgins boats. And then when we got to the coral reefs, we had to transfer to Amtracs. Here we lost a lot of men because we had so much weight on us. By the time we jumped, we had to wait till the Higgins boats and the Amtracs were level with each other in the surf and then jump. And some of them didn't make it. And those that fell in that were able to keep afloat at all were ground up between the 2 vessels. we just wanted to get in and out of there, actually, as if I can remember as much about it, it was just that I wanted to get on the beach and get somewhere.
How did beach look?
Beach was pretty bad, strewn with bodies, torn up vehicles, and vegetation all broken and torn up, and you could see the ridges that were being bombarded by the aircraft over there, and smoke. I mean, you know, just hell.
All through training exercises, the 4th Platoon had been the fire base for any attack operations. And so on D+1, when we shoved off, it was all planned. We had done this, we had taken Iwo Jima so many times in training. It was almost by rote we could do it. The aerial bombardment was supposed to be at 0700, and the artillery then would commence at 0715, and the tanks would jump off at 0730, and the infantry at 0732. None of this happened. The aerial was late, the artillery was even later. We jumped off, and we never did see the infantry. And we were the lead platoon. All through practice we're the fire base, and now we're the lead platoon. Some of us from the West Coast had seen Japanese civilians, of course. Most people from the South and Midwest had never seen a Japanese. Only our platoon sergeant, Bill Unger, had ever seen a Japanese soldier. Fortunately, he was the tank commander of my tank that morning. And we knew we were at the front when he suddenly said, "I don't see anybody." So we knew we were there. And then one of our tanks got hit with everything under the sun from an ambush, anti-tank ambush. And I don't think it was knocked out, though. And all we did after that, we were not like Patton in Europe. We were like mobile pillboxes. And I remember trying to take airfield number 1, and where the Japanese had changed their anti-tank guns, their anti-aircraft guns to fire horizontally, and they made excellent anti-tank weapons. And I guess that was about that time, about the D+5, when they committed the 3rd Tank Battalion. And the rumor was that all the tanks were going to go up there that day, hub to hub, and we were going to take that airfield. Or we're going to go back to the beach, dig the tanks in, and wait for the rest of the Corps to come up from Saipan, but we're not getting off the island. That was the rumor. But fortunately, we broke their back that day. I took number 1. And after that, every day seemed like the same. We had 1 bulldozer tank in each platoon, I think it was, or in each company. And the idea was to protect that bulldozer to keep the Japanese from blowing that blade off, because there were no roads. And once the bulldozer blade was off, the game was over until we could get that blade welded back on. And in the meantime, the Japanese would hit us with mortars, and we'd try to find the mortar positions and fire back at them. And you sit there on a road, you had no way to go sideways, and you try to outguess them as, oh, all right, move forward 50. That one came right down our tail, move forward 50. And the next one would be 10 yards in front of you. All right, move back 10. And just try to outguess whoever the mortarman was until they knocked him out. The infantry had knocked him out. But we were nothing more than mobile pillboxes. We had 1 flamethrower tank per platoon. And I don't remember that we ever used, the bow gunner ever used his flamethrower, but we used that flamethrower tank. And of course the infantry had their flamethrowers. And I've always been of the opinion that if it hadn't been for the flamethrower, we'd still be fighting the Japanese in the islands. It was the only thing to get those people out with. I guess it was about D+4, drizzly morning. We couldn't see because the rain kept coming down the periscopes, and so we turned off our engines and opened the hatches a little bit, hoping we could hear this rumored Japanese counterattack with tanks. but it never materialized. And then somebody alerted us to the fact that we should turn around and look at Suribachi, and there was that flag flying. And it was a great sight. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. About 10 o'clock in the morning, that first flag went up. One other morning, we were just sitting there avoiding mortar fire, moving forward, moving back, moving forward, moving back. And Unger and I were chess players. That we had that little miniature chess set on the breech block at 75. We're playing chess. And looked over, and in a shell hole, or a sort of a pit, there were a bunch of Marines lobbing grenades one way, and the Japanese lobbing grenades back at them, and one guy sitting over in a corner reading the letter. You know, the thing about it, you can't remember pain, because if you could, you'd be in the booby hatch, and no woman would ever have a second baby. But you do remember the humorous things. You do remember the humorous things. Now, that first morning when this tank in our platoon, or our company got hit, our platoon got hit, the driver was a good friend of mine, Robert Von Meggy, who lives in Los Angeles. And Von was the driver. And to my memory, now this may be an embellishment, I don't know, but it's a good story. We had the throat mics for intercommunication, and Von thought that we were on intercom, and actually we were outgoing. And so his message was heard all over the island and beyond. It was, "Lay off, you bastards, I'm a lover, not a fighter." As I recall, around, I think it was the 10th of March, and we were going to do the same thing. We had withdrawn the afternoon before because the infantry felt they couldn't hold the ground. So we withdrew for the night, and they got back to a position they could hold. And mind you, in these days, we were gaining 50, 100 yards a day. That's all we were making, 50, 100 yards a day. And we went up the next morning, and as I say, I was loading, and Schwartzel was the gunner, and Unger was the platoon sergeant and tank commander. And I think he told Tilseth, the driver, to stay in our same tracks. We were able to pick those up. And because we hadn't hit a mine the day before. He had no sooner said that than boom. I never heard it. I woke up, I was laying on the turret floor, bleeding like a stuck pig. And the tank I remember it was filled with dust. I heard some moaning down in front. It was Burris, the assistant driver. The other three guys had already left, not a scratch on them. And I think I put a thermite grenade in the breech block, but I don't know whether I did or not. But Burris was able to crawl over the transmission, and the two of us exited the driver's hatch. And by that time, Captain Sands' tank had moved up close to us. And we went over the front slope plate, hit the deck, and underneath Captain's tank, and I think there were bullets bouncing off the bogey wheels, but I'm not sure. But we got in through the escape hatch in Captain Sands' tank. Time we get back to the battlefield station, Burris was incapable of moving. Both his legs had been shattered. And I remember they helped him out the tank commander's hatch and slid him down the barrel of the 75 onto a stretcher. I was walking wounded, so I was all right. But there was no question about evacuating Burris. I didn't want to get evacuated, and to this day, I don't know whether I refused evacuation because I didn't want to leave my friends, or I was afraid of being put in an infantry replacement outfit. At any rate, they sent me to the field hospital, and a few hours later, some corpsman sewed my cheek up. He put 3 stitches in it, in this wound. And I asked him, no anesthesia, no nothing, and I asked him, I said, "What the hell did you do before the war, sew sacks?" And he said, "Yes," and he was from my hometown in California. I didn't know him. Now, my real story about this wound, this scar, is that, and I know this is an embellishment, there were 8 of them that came at me, and I only had 7 shots in my .45. The 8th guy slapped me right across the face with his sword. I have the sword.
every day at dawn we would get up and attack. I would hear from the captain that at dawn we're going to get up and we're going to attack. First there'd be an artillery barrage, and then we're going to go forward and just wipe these guys up. Well, the artillery barrage would come, and then we would get up out of our holes and go a few yards, and there'd be machine gun fire at us. We'd have to hit the deck and eventually go back to our holes because there was no way we could move. We were just pinned down. In fact, that next morning was about the worst time I ever had on Iwo, because the very next morning we were out for this attack, and we get pinned down, and we have a bunch of guys hit, and the corpsman would come up to take them out. The corpsman would get hit. And I remember we were just getting murderous fire from this line of hillocks just in front of us, murderous fire from machine guns from the Japanese. We were pinned down in our holes, we couldn't move. And remember, a corpsman came up to pull in one of the wounded, and the corpsman went to get him, and as he went to get him, he got shot through the arm, and his arm was just flopping around, like that. And he was knocked down, but of course he got up and ran. He got over to our holes, he got hit again, and we reached up and pulled him into our foxhole. And he had a great big hole in his arm. We put, at that time, we were supposed to put sulfa in, and then put on the dressing, I'd never given a shot of morphine, but he told us to open his kit, and get out some morphine and give it to him. So I did, And what saved us was fog. Fog came in and just, I didn't mention that this area we were on was very hot. It's like Iwo's a volcanic island, And it was so hot that you could dig down only about a foot. Once you got down a foot, it was so hot you couldn't stand it. So you could dig a foxhole only about a foot. Fortunately, there were other holes there that the Japanese had made, and there were shell holes we could use for foxholes, and dig a foxhole in the bottom of that, So we were enough underground, it was be safe. But by evening, after a full day, it was cooled off enough you could dig down about another 6 inches. The good part of it was if you wanted to cook anything, like a sea ration, all you had to do was punch a hole in the can so it wouldn't explode, and put it in this hot soil and it would cook. It was great. But anyway, the steam and the fog shielded things so we could get the wounded people out. But we were losing people. We lost about 5 or 6 people then, right that time, just that one supposed attack. We were stuck like that the next 4 or 5 days. They would bring up tanks, and the tanks would spray the whole area with, we would send another one of our guys who was experienced, a guy who'd been in the Raiders. He was a corporal named Anthony. He would go get aboard the tanks and try to point out to the tankers just where he spotted the things were firing at us. But they couldn't see them, and of course the Japanese would just go underground, and when the tanks were there, they have flat trajectory and they can't fire mortars, so unless you get a direct hit on the thing, you can't wipe it out. The Japanese would come right up as soon as the tanks had left and fire at us again. So we were stuck there for about 4 or 5 days, everything had just sort of ground to a halt. And then the 5th day, which was March 7th, I guess the 4th day, March 7th, I got word during the night that Colonel Pollock, who had the platoon on our right, who replaced the one that had been pulled out, replaced. He was going to make a dawn attack by surprise and with no artillery bombardment, hope to catch the Japanese off guard. So we should jump off just before dawn, just at first light, and move forward, and without a barrage, prepare time, and we would catch them. So we passed the word. We had to pass the word from foxhole to foxhole, and sure enough, at dawn we get up and we move out of our holes, into this rough country just ahead of us, where all this heavy fire had been coming from. I'm moving with the guys, and we get to the very first line of hills, and one of the what happened was that one of our guys spotted a Japanese who was supposed to be a sentry, was sitting there asleep, just sitting there like this with his head in his lap. He was supposed to be watched. The other guys were all underground. Well, he shot this guy, and of course that that set off the alarm for the Japanese. So they all come running up out of their cave, out of this big cave they were in. We figured out there were two embrasures. We figured this out pretty quick because there were Japanese coming out of both ends of the cave, and we were right amongst them. The remnants of the platoon were there, And I was at the front end of I went back and forth between my two units, We had two units ready fighting that couldn't see each other, but were very close together. And I remember Sisk, the big fella from Indiana, was in charge of one, and he was up hard by the cave, By that time, they had killed a lot of Japanese just outside the cave. They shot them and killed them with grenades. He was right up near the cave's opening, and he was throwing grenades into the cave, and one time a great big piece of what I know now was liver came out and just landed at my feet. And Sis said, we're really getting at it. We're really getting him now. It was a piece of Japanese liver. And then the flamethrower came up, and the flamethrower squirted the cave, and they all ran out the back end of it, There was the other end of the cave, and I'd been there just a moment or two earlier. And there were just about 6 of us that were up at the other side of the cave, up at the end of a draw, just a gully. And we suddenly got a lot of fire from our left, from the gully. And my men all went up to the edge of the gully, and grenades began to come at us. They would hit the ground and then it roll down into the gully and explode. And our guys were throwing grenades down the other way at the Japanese, who were firing up at them from below and throwing the grenades back. We were pulling the pin, and we'd hold it for a couple of seconds, then roll it down or throw it, so it would explode, not giving them time to throw it back. But they were shooting at us too. We were just getting a hell of a fire. And remember, Nick put his helmet up, and it came back with a big hole in it. And Frost, my other squad leader, he'd been a barman, and the Browning automatic rifle. He had a Browning automatic rifle that weighed about 20 pounds and gave semi-automatic fire. And he was up there as long as he could, And I remember he backed off with this from this heavy fire, holding this bar. And he said, "Christ Almighty!" He said, "There's hundreds of them in there. Why can't they send a whole company instead of just a couple of squads?" And I said, "It's all we got, Frost, Anyway, the captain, I was on the radio with him. I was telling him what was going on, and he says, "Can you use a half-track?" Half-track's a track vehicle that has a 75 millimeter. Yes, send it up. So he sent it up, and boy, it steamed right up to the edge, and it just is armored, and it was able to fire right down, point-blank fire at the Japanese, and we were really, really getting him. It took this couldn't have taken more than about 5 minutes total, this firefight. But we got back on top. Once the half-track got there, we were able to come up, and our grenades were really getting him. The other thing that Sisk was doing, he was throwing grenades over the ridge, so they would hit the Japanese as they came out of the cave and back. There must have been, I think, about 50 or 60 Japanese that were killed outside the cave, and I don't know how many of them died in the cave because we never got inside. I didn't get inside. Some of the guys did go inside and came out with a couple of swords and things, but I didn't go in the cave. I just had other things to do. But things got pretty quiet about that time. We'd had some casualties, and we had to evacuate the casualties. And it looked like we were on top of things, The Japanese, all the Japanese we knew about were dead, and the cave was silenced, and we thought we were in pretty good shape, We'd lost half a dozen people, but most of them wounded, not killed. And I was standing there talking about 50 feet from the cave with a couple of the guys. Suddenly there's tremendous noise like nothing I've ever heard before or since, just the most god-awful noise you can imagine. And I turn around and I see this hillside where the cave was, just rising up in the air, just going straight up, and I thought, my God, rocks and boulders, big boulders. And So then it starts to fall, it goes out like a mushroom cloud, then begins to fall. And so I hit the deck. There's nothing else to do. There's no place to hide. I just hit the deck, and all this stuff began to land on my back, and I thought, my God, I'm being buried here. So some of it hurt, But I was lucky again, because if I'd been a few feet farther out, the biggest rocks would have hit me. That explosion killed quite a few people. Were killed by the size of the biggest rocks, We had to dig them out. But the people that were in closer, not too close to be blown up, but close enough, they got a lighter kind of rubble, The big rocks had gone over my head. So I was only half buried, and when it all stopped, I could sort of force myself up, and out. Remember, our radio had an aerial that was bent, but it still worked. And I told the captain, I said, we've got to have stretcher bearers up here. We've got a bunch of people that need help right now. So the captain came forward with the whole headquarters company. They all came up with stretchers, and they dug the people out and took them back, the ones that were still alive. And meantime, I'd taken the people that the captain had told me. He said, be sure you make sure that the line is plugged, because sometimes when they do that, there's a counterattack. So I took what guys could still walk, and we went up and made a line to the, in case any Japanese came through it, but none of them did. There was nobody left. They had to counterattack at that time. Anyway, I was kind of shook, everybody was kind of shook. But, and I didn't mention that during this firefight, I had a hell of a time keeping in touch with the captain by radio, I was just involved in the firefight, trying to shoot and to make sure that, go back and forth, make sure I knew what was going on. And the idea of, working this switch and talking to him was just difficult. He kept chewing me out, you gotta keep on, tell me what's happening, don't forget to press the switch. So I tried to tell him, but anyway. We got things together after a while, and then we decided we would go forward and attack, because we thought it was a good time to attack. We had a few people left, and what was left of the platoon next to us from the other battalion, they had lost heavily too, and they'd lost their platoon leader, so they were combined with my outfit into one outfit, we would go forward the attack. So we go through this rough country for about 400 or 500 yards. Every so often be stopped by an occasional rifleman who would hit us, one time by a machine gun, but there were not many of them, and it was open enough country that we could take them out, one by one. And we got to, we made about 500 yards, the only gain we made during my whole time there. But it was really good, pretty good gain. And that brought us into some really rough country where we could see the ocean just beyond us, but we could see that it was dropped off. By this time, it's nearly dark. So I told the captain what it was like, and he said, you better find a place to dig in. So we decided to dig in just inside this area, where we began to get some fire from up ahead. So we dug in because it was pretty close to dark. We wanted to dig in before dark. And we began to get some pretty heavy fire about that time from the area ahead. And I lost two people that I really cared about a lot. One was Anthony, the old raider. I say old, he must have been 30, but he seemed old as hell to me. He was badly shot in the hip. I'd sent him out to make sure that there were no caves or snipers left behind the area we had just overrun. And he got shot by somebody doing that. His hip was laid open, and I never saw him again till he was taken out. And I never found out what happened to him. He came from Oklahoma. And then Sith, the guy that had done so well at the cave, was putting out wire just before dark, and I heard a shot and then this terrible groan, just an awful groan. I could see him crawling, and he had gut shot with a rifle bullet, We got him evacuated, and some of the guys saw him in the hospital afterward, but I never did. He died about 2 months afterward of peritonitis in the hospital at Pearl. So sad, But anyway, he was such a good Marine, you know, he was always out in front, always doing what had to be done, out putting up wire. He knew he could have been shot, but he just did it, you know. Somebody had to do it, and he wouldn't ask anybody else to do it. He did it himself. They were the best troops anybody could ever want to serve with.
Colonel Damke didn't think I did enough work. So then he called me in, he says, Fisk, what in the hell do you do? So I told him, I said, well, I get the buglers up and sound a couple of calls today. And he says, then what are you doing? I didn't dare tell him I went to the Red Cross Shack to have donuts and coffee, see. So I said, well, I get everything together. He said, what's everything? Well, he was a stickler for detail. I said, well, I'd go and make sure the buglers know exactly what they're going to do and who's going to do what. He said, I don't think you're doing your job. I said, sir, I am. I'm the regimental sergeant bugler. He says, I know that. He says, but you don't do much. So he said, I tell you what. He says, we're short on assistant platoon leaders. And I said, oh boy, I knew what that's going to entail. So he says, now you're going to be the assistant platoon leader for your outfit with the 13th Marines. I was about ready to open my mouth, and he says, you're dismissed. That started me on the road to Iwo. That was up at the Big Island. And then we trained, and then we didn't get our briefing. We went aboard ship in January. So we had about almost 30 days at sea, getting all the flotilla and all the ships together, the task force and all that. And we anchored at Saipan and Tinian. And then that was about 2 weeks before the actual landing on Iwo Jima. Then they gave us a briefing, and we saw this relief map of this little tiny island. We said, oh my gosh, we can take that in a week, no problem. So this lieutenant says, well, he says, you guys got a piece of cake. He said, within about 5 to 7 days, he said, we should be home. Yes, sir. We took his word for it. He lied. It took us 4 days to take Mount Suribachi. We haven't even touched the rest of the island. 4 days just to take Mount Suribachi. At the cost of about almost 1,000 Marines. Then we started on the other half of the island. That was 34 days of constant fighting, almost 24 hours a day. If there was a hell, we went through it on Iwo Jima. It took us 34 days to capture the island, and the 5th Marine Division, we had 5,892 dead, over 17,000 wounded. The Japanese had approximately 25,000 on the island. And at the end of 33 days, or 34 days, we only took 337 prisoners. I have never in my life have been through anything like that. It was over 2.5 weeks before we could even begin to bury our dead. We just didn't have the time. And you fought day and night. You'd go to another guy's foxhole and try to wake him up, and he just looked at you through eyes that cannot see. Up on Hill 362, the meat grinder, we lost over 200 Marines to try to take that in about 3 hours. The carnage, the death was You'd have to be there to see it. I have never in my life have seen so many dead Marines and dead Japanese. And you look at those, and you look at your own, and you just think, my God, what have we done? Why is this possible? Why do we have to do it? It's not because we wanted. We were ordered to do it. Finally, when we left the island, there was just 6 from my outfit, and we were on the fantail as just glad to get the hell out of there. We secured the island, we turned it over to the Army for occupation. And I remember Green and a couple of the other guys were on the fantail. We were looking at the island, and none of us said much. But as we were slowly leaving the island on, Green looked at me and he says, Sarge, was it worth it? I said, I don't know. I said, we lost a lot of our friends. He said, yeah. And until it disappeared, the island, none of us said anything more. And all the way going back to Hilo, everybody was so quiet with their own thoughts and wondered, my God, what did we go through? And we're still here. I'll never forget that.
We went along on the march for a while, not really knowing what to expect. We had all seen the Japanese up close, and we knew what the uniforms looked like. We knew everything about them. But I remember at one point looking at one of these Jap soldiers, and he looked just like a picture I'd had in the history book of Attila the Hun. And I thought, well, that's a pretty good description. But we went on our way, and I developed a fine skill of being unnoticed. I found that anybody who attracted attention would almost invariably get the wrong kind of attention. About halfway along, when people would come alongside of the road, and they would give us V for victory, and if they could, they'd pass to us little packets of rice wrapped in banana leaves. At this point, a little girl, she was about adolescent or thereabouts, and she ran up to the line and gave a soldier a packet of rice, and there was a Japanese soldier coming right up to her, and he didn't like what had happened. He knocked that packet of rice to the ground, took his rifle butt and smashed her right in the center of the face. And you could hear the bones of her head crushing. They were just like somebody had stuck a hatchet into a melon, just crushed her. And she dropped to the ground like a rag doll. And the other Japanese soldiers were unhappy about that, but they couldn't do anything. We couldn't do anything, and the little girl was just dropped like a rag doll. Later, about half an hour later, we were going along a little farther, and a Filipino signaled to some of us. there was a man from the 19th Bomb was near me, and the Filipino ran up to give him the packet of rice, handed to him, and a rifle shot rang out, and the Filipino dropped. And apparently it was the same guy that had hit the little girl, had fired the shot. And the packet of rice dropped no more than 2 or 3 feet away from the guy in the 19th Bomb. And he hesitated for just a second. I told him, I said, don't do it. You know, it isn't worth it. And he thought it over. He was hungry, and he was going to go for it. So he did, and that rifle shot again, and he dropped right over the packet of rice. That was about the way it went.
They marched us back to some place, I don't know the name of it, where we sat down for a while and then eventually marched on farther to a rail spur. And then we were put in 40 and 8s, and they are designed to hold 40 men or 8 horses. They're much smaller than American boxcars, as you probably know. They crammed about 70 or 75 of us in there. You couldn't all sit down or stand at the same time. We had about half of us would try to walk in a circle, and the other half would sit. Then we'd change positions. Well, Christmas Day, I think we were in the boxcar somewhere between 7 and 8 days. But anyhow, Christmas Day was the 5th day. I do recall that, because the Germans were singing Christmas carols outside. And I found out later it took us almost 9 days to move 200 miles. That's how bad our planes had the tracks shot up. So eventually, we got no food while we were in there. They put in 2 buckets of water a day. And we did not get out at all for latrine purposes. Fortunately, it was cold, and all the excrement froze. If it had been summertime, it would have been terrible. But a couple of guys died in there. And the only thing we could do with them was stack them one on top of the other and use them for a seat. But we headed on up to Hammelburg. They put us in the Stalag at Hammelburg. That's the same one that Patton's son-in-law was in. And you recall perhaps he launched a big raid to try to save him and lost his whole column in there. But anyhow, I was at Hammelburg for, several weeks, I guess. And we got no breakfast in Hammelburg. We were in stables, quartered in stables, stone stables, and it was cold, around 0. And you had one little tiny coal-fired heater in there. If you were more than 3 feet from there, you were cold. We slept on a board, had one blanket, and we got no breakfast. We got a dipper of tea at noon, and we got 2 little new potatoes about the size of small eggs for dinner. Well, I soon found there was a method to that. After feeding us that type of fare for about a week, they came in and said, now, if you will volunteer to go out and work, you'll get better food. Well, I was a non-com, so I didn't have to volunteer. But I figured it couldn't be any worse than this, so I did volunteer. I had been holding church services in the Stalag there. They let me do that, and I kind of hated to give that up, but seemed like it was going to be a matter of survival. So I was put on a train, sent down the Main. The Main River is the one that runs through Frankfurt. It's Frankfurt on Main. While we were north of Frankfurt, There was a fairly good-sized town called Markheidenfeld, but then we were put into, the fellows that volunteered that they sent down there, there's 53 of us, we were sent to a little village called Hoffenlohr. And we were told we were going to work in a factory. Well, it was some factory. We were put into some barracks about a quarter mile from the factory out of this little village. All 53 of us, this barracks. But this factory that they put us in was a baby crib factory.
It would go in streaks. It would be halfway, they'd be halfway civilized to us, and other times they wouldn't be. Well, some of the guards they all had English in high school when they went to school. But they couldn't, you can't, just like if you studied Spanish in school, you couldn't go to Mexico and talk Spanish to them, and they couldn't do that. But they were all, some of the ones that were more humane would want to practice their English. One day he asked them if tables were turned. Now this is what he asked them, and this is what he was thinking. If tables were turned, and he was a prisoner, and they were the guards, would they come in and cut his throat at night? Now that's what the guard asked them. Well, they didn't have any idea what he talked about, and they wanted to agree with him about everything because he was good to them. So they said, oh yeah. Well, that whole detail turned into a hell detail. And that night, that they took, they started beating us if we didn't go fast with a pick handle, to make us go faster and everything like that. We couldn't figure out what was wrong. And that night, they took the guys from that mining car. There was 3 or 4 of them on each car. I can't remember for sure. And then the mining car above that, next to them, and the one on each side of them. So there was probably 7, 8, 9 people there. And the Japs guards lived on one side, and we lived on the other side. And they had a flagpole with a joke, flaming there in the center. Well, they tied those guys to the flagpole there, and they got pick handles, and they beat those guys unmercifully for about 4 o'clock till dark, till after dark, and they just beat them as hard as they could on the backs with those pick handles. And when they turned them loose and brought them back to camp, they couldn't hardly walk or anything. They were all beat to pieces. And none of those guys ever worked again. And they sent them away to where they had an American hospital, a hospital for prisoners at Bilibid, an old Spanish prison. And they sent them there. But whether any of those guys survived or not, I don't know. I doubt it very much. But from then on, every time you'd slow down or something, boy, you'd get a pick handle across your back, and you'd get stood at attention and knocked down, and all kinds of things. Just mean, just hated us from then on.
They sent me to a place called Stalag 17A. And that wasn't all that bad because the Germans at war were still going pretty good for them. So they treated us pretty good. And then if you wanted to get out of camp, you could bribe your way out with 2 cigarettes. But you had to be careful once you got out. See if they caught you around any railroad track or anything like that after dark. They didn't ask no questions, they shot you. And if you got out of a prison camp in the middle of Germany and you never had any money, your chances of paying out were pretty slim. The only hope you had was you'd get captured by somebody who wasn't going to shoot you. And so anyway, the escapes and one thing and another got to be so rampant that they moved us to a place called Stalag 17B. And I remember the first formation we had when we got there, they lined us all up, and Sergeant Turk was the German in charge of the camp. He had colonel above him, but he was the guy that did what the colonel said. He lined us all up, and we all had to stand there at attention, and he said, "Gentlemen, I must tell you this. Escaping will no longer be the sport. Anyone trying to escape will be shot." And we all threw our hats up in the air and cheered. And a couple of days later, somebody tried it, and he had a nice funeral. Escaping from Stalag 17B wasn't like Hogan's Heroes and the movie. It was damn serious business. You'd have to get shot.
When we all arrived in Shanghai, until day whatever it was to come home from Japan, we were inundated with lice in our clothes and fleas. And that was the darndest thing you can ever experience, is to have your clothing filled with lice and no way to get rid of them. At night before you go to bed, you'd try to take off your clothes and kill all the lice with your fingernails, but you could never get them all. And in the morning there'd be a new supply of them. And the fleas jumping all over all the time. But working in that shipyard, my brother and I were able to take our clothes off and put them in boiling water, and that kills lice and fleas very rapidly, instantly. So we had an advantage working there in that shipyard. However, the war was about to come to an end in 1945, and what we experienced there was mass bombings of Osaka by the American B-29s and P-51s. And our shipyard was destroyed, and so was part of our camp. Just before that was probably about 4 months before the war ended. And so they had to get us out of there. They marched us to a train, and we were taken up into northern Japan, where they had a stainless steel mill. And we were what you might call slave laborers again, just carrying things around from one place to the other in that stainless steel plant until the war ended. I would say in Osaka, during the daytime, we were always with civilians. The Japanese guards were surrounding the shipyard so that nobody's you would never try to escape there. You couldn't go anywhere. But the Japanese would march you there, and you didn't interface with them all day long. So the civilians were very, in fact, if it hadn't been for they helped us. They helped provide little bits of food, and they were starving themselves, but they felt compassionate. That didn't happen in Shanghai, but it did in Osaka. It didn't happen up in northern Japan either. And we appreciate that. I could never locate those people, though, that befriended us. I tried.
Camp life wasn't that bad. We got parcels. Red Cross deserves a lot of credit for keeping me alive there. And I continue to remember them with periodic contributions. The Red Cross parcel had enough basic food even without what the Germans gave you, probably to keep you, it would keep you alive and in reasonable physical shape. The Germans gave us potatoes and hot water for coffee in the morning with they gave you ersatz stuff, you know. The bread was black bread, and I didn't. First time I got it when in the farmhouse, I didn't like it, but then it tasted like cake after a few months. They marched us out when the Russians got within about 15 miles, and that was the worst experience. The 3 weeks on the road, and then finally into boxcars. And I remember walking along, crying, and I got mad. You know, I said, "You're not going to kill me like this." I had frozen tears on my face. I was just exhausted. And it was always 6 more kilometers to go. We were told not to escape. The colonel said, "You will be, you could be court-martialed if you escape," because he said the Germans have SS men on the perimeters, and especially the Hungarian SS. If they pick you up, they just shoot you. He said, "So you are under orders not to escape." I got down to a little town called Gamelsdorf, and I could hear the artillery. I could hear 105s or whatever they were, 155s, and I knew the Americans were coming. And I said, "Geez, I'm just going to stay here. I'm not going to." And we were told the next morning we were going to go into the permanent camp, and then the capper was that was the day that we were told by laughing Germans that Roosevelt is dead. Roosevelt is tot. Ha ha. You know, and I'd never lost a president before. But I said to myself, you know, I'm tired of this. I don't want to go back into another camp. The American Army is going to be here in the next couple of days. I'll just stay behind. After 2 days, the artillery stopped, and I said, "Oh, they swung somewhere else, and I'm going to run out of food here, and I'm going to have to give myself up, and I don't want to do that because they'll kill me." And so I said, "Well, I know where I am, and I know where I have to go." And so over the next 10 or 12 days, I walked about 120 kilometers down to Kempten and Dornbirn, and finally got down to the and there's a point of Switzerland that is joined by Germany and Austria, and it's very mountainous, and you travel valleys, but you know there are signposts that tell you where you are, and again there's so many refugees. There's thousands of Germans moving around trying to get out of the Russian zone. That there's just mass confusion. The only problem I had in traveling that is that I didn't have any papers, and I couldn't walk across a bridge. So what do you do when you can't walk across a bridge? You have to swim the river. So I was always wet, and there's nothing as wet as a GI overcoat. You can take your shirt off and dry your pants out, but that coat never dries. And I swam 4 rivers. Finally got to the border, and I knew it was the border into Switzerland because I knew it was the Rhine River, and there was a barbed wire on the German side, substantial barbed wire, double system with tangle wire in the middle. Watched the German guards and their dogs walk it, so I used the same, and they would walk it at 4 o'clock, and then they would walk it the next morning, and I said, I got to get out of here. And if I'm going to do it, I'm going to get out at night. So I got down to the wire, and of course then I realized that I didn't exactly know where the Germans had walked, and I started to say, you know, this could be bad because Germans were known to mine their barbed wire fence systems, either internally as you touch the wire or mostly in the ground, 3 feet down. So I started to dig, and I didn't have any tools, and I bloodied my hands and got through the first strands. The tangle wire was the worst because you can't avoid it. You know, you lift it, and just when you think you're out, it's caught your pants, and and I ripped myself up quite a bit, and finally got through. And going through the last one, I was so afraid that I was going to die or be caught there and shot that my tongue stuck to the top of my mouth. And that's an awful feeling. I had no moisture in my body. So I was dehydrated, totally fearful. Then I stumbled, ripped my clothes, ripped my head, stumbled into the Rhine River, which isn't a big river at that point. It was probably 100 yards wide, flowing rather swiftly because it's just coming down out of the Alps, and floated, with the flow of the river, and I could touch the ground near the bottom in most places, but I could swim too, and kind of got myself up to the other bank and just kind of collapsed, kind of fitfully passed out. Got up the next morning, all stiff, cold as hell, and stumbled out on this little road and walked along. I didn't know. I just knew I had to go somewhere, rather than just sit there and die. And I was stumbling along this road, and this guy on a bike came roaring around the corner, and he stops and gets off the bike, and he's got a uniform on. It looks like a German uniform, a blue-gray uniform. And I said, "Oh God, after all this, didn't I get out?" I thought maybe I'd cross back in or did some dumb thing. I was really almost delirious at that time, and I kind of stumbled to him, and I said, I got within about 20 feet. I don't know what I look like, but it would be nice to have that picture right now. But he was kind of apprehensive, because I was covered with blood and all sorts of things, mud and wet, miserable, mean looking probably. And I said, "Ich bin Amerikaner," and this guy said, "Je suis."
We were impounded in Bilibid prison, which is the north edge of Manila. And from there we were taken on up to a railroad station not far from there. And they had little cars, little railroad cars. They called them, they were the size of the French 40 and 8. 40 and 8 being for 40 soldiers or 8 horses. And they put 100 of the prisoners in each one, and then the order came down that they had to put in 15 more. And so with prodding with bayonets and shoving and yelling and screaming, which they did a lot of, they would get in as many more as they could. And then this was in May, and it was very hot in the tropics. And they closed up the doors, and they had boarded up all of the air vents and everything there. And we stayed there through that day, and the air got very bad, and it got very hot, and some of the fellows had dysentery, and you couldn't move around. You just breathe in the face of the one that was facing you. And as fellows would die, they would gradually sink down, and all you could do was stand on them. And it reminded me of back on the farm. In the wintertime, when we'd have late spring bad weather, and little chickens would be under the brooder stove in the little chicken house. And as the young ones would freeze to death, or some of them would freeze to death and die, the others would stand on them and all crowd together to keep warm. And that reminded me of this in that terrible situation in that boxcar. Well, they moved us on up, and eventually we got up to another camp called Cabana Tawan. We went up to Camp 3, which was beyond 1 and 2. And we were impounded there, and I recall a lot of the fellows getting bayoneted on the way because they were so weak they couldn't keep up. and they would be screamed at and beat, and as they would collapse, they would be killed. And one of the fellows right at the gate, when they stopped us to inspect us, offered $100 American money for a drink of water, and of course no one had any. And to make his point, he held up a $100 bill and repeated it, and one of the guards saw it, Japanese guards, and came over and jerked his canteen away from him, and he had stuffed it with $100 bills. And so they took him off and, as I said, punished him severely, which meant after they tortured him, they killed him. And then we went on into camp. We were taken by trucks from Camp 1 down to Manila, put back in Bilibid, and then the next day we were marched down to be put in these ships. And the ship that we were put in was an old, very dilapidated ship. I didn't think it would even float. But anyway, we were shoved in there so tight and so close. They would move 100 group in at a time, and it was really packed in there. And we had to go over the gun wall that was about 18 inches high and drop down into this hole, which was probably 16 or 17 feet deep. And if you didn't move fast enough, the guard would just kick you and knock you over into there, and you would fall. And the first hold was filled up, and our group was next to fill in the front hold of the two holds in the ship. And so as I went down in there, I noticed the rack at the back, and there were two fellows up on it already. And so I crawled up with them, and the rest of them packed in there. And we were on the ship from that time for 2 months getting to Japan. And this was a time when there were a lot of American submarines out there. These were unmarked ships, and they were covered on the deck with contraband from the Philippines, rolls of wire, scrap metal, and things that they could melt down. And so there was no way for the American subs to know that there were prisoners in there. And we would start out to go out into the China Sea out there, and then they would come back in, and back and forth and back and forth. And during this time, they would let down maybe a can of tea, weak tea, or a can of half-cooked rice for all of these hundreds of men. And there was no way that you could get any of it. And if you did get it, you'd probably get into a terrible fight. And it got to the point where men were going stark raving mad. But anyway, the fellow on my right started screaming one night and kicking. And we helped pull his leg back up, and one of the other prisoners had gone completely berserk and was chewing on his toes. And when it got light, we saw that one of his toes had been chewed off and part of the other one, and apparently he was so numb and so paralyzed he didn't realize what was happening until it got quite painful. Anyway, there was a lot of things like that went on those hell ships. And those are things that it's hard for anyone that hears it or reads about it to really realize the condition that existed there. Because in reading it or listening to it, you can't feel the heat, or you can't feel the desperation, or the revert to the animal type that I guess we all are without civilization. But as we docked in Japan proper on the island of Kyushu, the southern island, I don't remember it at all. I was unconscious, but I know that when I came to, I was laying on a cement floor that looked to me like a cowshed, and it had a cement gutter there like they have behind the stanchioned cows in a cow barn. And some of the other prisoners were there, And they told me that we were now in Japan and that we were on the southern island. And the next thing I remember was that they were marching us out to get some food. And the interpreter, they had a pretty good interpreter then who we could understand. And he was telling us that now we would be issued warm clothing and we'd be getting Toksan, which was a lot of food, and that we would be now considered as prisoners of war, and we would have the pleasure of being the guest of the emperor, and that we would be assigned to different work details.